There were battles in history where both sides fought brilliantly, and the better man simply won. Munda was not one of those battles. At Munda, the side that held every advantage, the high ground, superior numbers, veteran cavalry, and a defensive position that should have been impregnable, collapsed in less than an hour because a single tactical decision was misread by the very soldiers it was designed to protect. 30,000 men died not because Caesar was a genius, though he was. They died because of what panic does to an army when it strikes at exactly the wrong moment. That is not how history remembers this battle. History remembers Munda as the inevitable, final, crushing triumph of the greatest military mind Rome ever produced, the death blow to the Republic, the moment Julius Caesar became the undisputed master of the known world. All of that is true, but it buries the real story, which is far stranger, far darker, and far more instructive. The story of Munda is the story of how Gnaeus Pompey the Younger, a commander who was not incompetent, positioned his army almost perfectly and then watched it disintegrate in minutes because of what his own cavalry looked like from the inside of his battle line. It is the story of how Titus Labienus, one of the most experienced military officers in the Roman world, made a tactically sound decision that his own men interpreted as desertion. And it is the story of how 8 hours of brutal, grinding, uphill combat, the kind that was killing Caesar's veterans faster than they could be replaced, was decided not by the soldiers doing the fighting, but by the ones watching from the rear. Understanding why that happened requires going back further than most accounts go, not just to the death of Pompey the Great, but to the nature of the war itself, what it actually was, who was actually fighting it, and why Hispania, of all places, became the place where the Roman world was finally settled. This video is going to give you the real Battle of Munda, the terrain, the formations, the 8 hours of fighting that history compresses into a single paragraph, the moment when everything changed, and the question that nobody asks about this victory, whether Caesar, in winning so completely, destroyed something he could never replace. Before we walk every meter of that slope, if you are the kind of person who wants the real story of history, the tactics, the terrain, the blood and the dust, and the genius and the catastrophic human error behind one of antiquity's most decisive battles, hit that subscribe button and join us. Drop a comment below and tell me where you are watching from. Stories like this deserve to be told properly, and that is exactly what we are going to do.
The year is 46 BC. Julius Caesar has just returned to Rome from Africa carrying the head of a war, or so he believes. At Thapsus, just months earlier, the Pompeian cause in Africa had been shattered so thoroughly that Caesar staged 4 consecutive triumphs through the streets of Rome, 4 processions, 4 days, 4 civilizations worth of captured treasure and conquered enemies paraded before a city that had not slept in years. The civil war that had begun when Caesar crossed the Rubicon in 49 BC had claimed Pompey the Great, had claimed Cato the Younger, had claimed the careers and fortunes and lives of dozens of the most powerful men in Roman history. Caesar had won. The fact was not really in dispute by anyone who is still alive. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that settles over a city after a long war. Rome felt it. The streets felt it. The Senate, which had been hemorrhaging genuine power for decades, felt it in a way that was almost physical, like the slow leak of blood from a wound that has gone on too long. Caesar felt something different. He felt the shape of what was still unfinished. Because even as he was celebrating in Rome, a problem was gathering momentum in the far west of his empire that would prove, in the end, to be the most dangerous thing he had ever faced. Hispania, modern Spain, had been Pompeian territory for a generation. Pompey the Great had governed it, built his networks there, recruited his soldiers there, relied on its resources throughout his career. When the great man died on an Egyptian beach in 48 BC, stabbed by the advisors of a boy king while his wife watched from a nearby ship, the Pompeian cause did not die with him. It transferred. It compressed itself into the men who survived him and who had everything to lose from Caesar's total victory. The most significant of those men was Gnaeus Pompey, the eldest son. He was not his father. History has often been cruel to Gnaeus on this point, largely because his father was impossible to equal, and because his ultimate defeat at Munda has colored every assessment of his generalship that came after. But the man who raised an army in Hispania in 46 and 45 BC was not an amateur. He was a survivor of multiple campaigns, a man who understood logistics, and a commander who had spent years watching his father operate at the highest level of Roman military art. He knew how armies moved. He knew how supply lines worked. He knew how to recruit. What he built in Hispania was remarkable by any measure. 13 legions, nearly 70,000 men, supported by 6,000 elite cavalry under the command of Titus Labienus. And Labienus is a name that demands a moment of attention before we go any further, because understanding who Labienus was fundamentally changes how you read the battle that followed. Titus Labienus had been Caesar's most trusted officer during the Gallic Wars, not a subordinate in the distant administrative sense, not a staff officer who received orders and carried them out. Labienus had been Caesar's operational right hand, the man who commanded the critical engagements when Caesar could not be everywhere at once, the man who understood Caesar's tactical instincts so thoroughly that he could implement them without being told. During the campaigns in Gaul, Labienus had been the hammer Caesar swung when precision was required. He had won battles that Caesar himself had not been present to win. And then the civil war began, and Labienus chose Pompey. The reasons for that choice have been debated for 2,000 years. Some historians point to personal loyalty to the Senate and the Republican cause. Some suggest genuine moral objections to what Caesar was doing to Roman institutions. Some, more cynically, note that Labienus was a man who had grown extremely powerful and wealthy under Caesar's patronage, and that powerful men do not always respond well when they recognize that their patron is about to become something more than a patron, something that will, by necessity, diminish every other man around him. Whatever the reason, Labienus crossed to the Pompeian side with his full knowledge of Caesar's methods, his full understanding of Caesar's weaknesses, and an intimate familiarity with how Caesar thought in a tactical crisis. Caesar never forgave this. More precisely, and this is a detail that most accounts omit, Caesar never stopped being frightened of it. Labienus was the only opponent in this war who genuinely understood him. Every other Pompeian commander was working from the outside, trying to anticipate a military intelligence they had observed but not participated in.
Had participated. He had been inside Caesar's decisions. He knew not just what Caesar would do, but why. And that made the army at Munda, 13 legions, 70,000 men, 6,000 cavalry, commanded by a man who knew Caesar's playbook from the inside, potentially the most dangerous force the Pompeian cause had ever assembled. The question was where to fight, and the Pompeians answered it correctly. The city of Munda sat in the southern region of Hispania Ulterior, the terrain rolling and broken in the way that Iberian geography tends to roll and break. Not the flat killing grounds of the Italian plain, not the open desert of Africa, but hills and ridges and slopes that compress armies and neutralize the kind of large-scale cavalry flanking that Caesar had used to decisive effect at Pharsalus. The Pompeians chose a ridge overlooking the plain, a ridge steep enough that attacking uphill would cost an enormous tactical penalty, a ridge wide enough to accommodate 13 legions in full-depth formation, a ridge close enough to the city of Munda that their rear was anchored against a defended position, which meant that Caesar could not simply maneuver around them and threaten their supply lines. To destroy the Pompeian army, Caesar would have to come to them. He came. He had no real choice, as we will see. But before we get to the morning of March 17th, 45 BC, before the first javelin was thrown and the first man scrambled up that slope, we need to stop and dismantle something that almost every account of this battle gets fundamentally wrong. Most accounts of Munda treat the battle as essentially decided before it began. Caesar had genius. Caesar had the veteran 10th Legion. Caesar had Bogud's Moorish cavalry. Of course he was going to win. The outcome reads, in most tellings, as inevitable, a foregone conclusion that merely required time and blood to execute. This is wrong. It is so wrong that it would have been unrecognizable to anyone who stood on that plain and watched the first 8 hours of the engagement. The truth is that for most of the Battle of Munda, Caesar was losing. Not losing in the sense of a tactical setback that could be managed, losing in the sense that his men were being ground down by the combined effects of uphill assault, sustained javelin fire from the Pompeian rear ranks, and the simple physical mathematics of attacking a deeper formation from below. Caesar's legions were exhausted before they had been fighting for an hour. The slope did what slopes always do to attacking infantry. It slowed them. It shortened their breath, it weighted their shields, it shifted the balance of every individual combat slightly in favor of the defender standing above. Multiply that slight shift by 50,000 individual combats happening simultaneously across a 3-kilometer front, and you have a catastrophe assembling itself one man at a time. The historians who call this battle inevitable are working backwards from the result. They know Caesar won, so they read the engagement looking for the signs of his genius. The signs are there, but they were not visible from inside the battle. From inside the battle, for most of a long March afternoon, the situation looked to many of Caesar's officers like the possibility of the worst defeat of his career. We know this because Caesar himself tells us, or rather because the accounts that draw on sources close to Caesar document what he did next. At some point in those brutal first hours, with his right wing beginning to buckle under the combined pressure of the uphill fighting and the sustained punishment from the Pompeian rear ranks, Caesar did something that no Roman general was supposed to do. He took off his helmet so his men could see his face. He walked into the fight. He stood beside the veterans of the 10th Legion, in the line, under missile fire, visible to every man on that section of the slope. This was not a tactical decision, it was a psychological one. It was a commander telling his army, without words, without the ability to shout over the noise of that engagement, that he was willing to die with them. And it worked in the way that such things sometimes work, not because it changed the physics of the situation, but because it changed the psychology. The right wing stopped buckling. The 10th Legion pushed. But here is what that moment actually tells us about the battle. A commander who is winning does not need to remove his helmet and walk into a melee. You do that when you are out of options.
You do that when the line is about to break and you have nothing left to throw at the problem except yourself. Caesar's heroic moment at Munda, the moment most accounts treat as evidence of his invincible character, was actually a crisis response. He was saving a battle he was in danger of losing. Keep that in mind as we walk through what happened next, because the battle that followed was not a foregone conclusion. It was a sequence of decisions made under enormous pressure by commanders on both sides who were genuinely trying to solve tactical problems in real time. And the outcome turned on a single misreading that was, in a terrible sense, completely understandable. Let us go back to before dawn on March 17th, 45 BC. Caesar's army had been marching for days. Hispania in early spring is cold in the mornings, the kind of damp chill that gets into lorica segmentata and settles in the joints of men who have been sleeping on campaign. His force of roughly 40,000, 8 legions at varying strength, plus auxiliary forces and cavalry, had been tracking the Pompeian army for weeks, looking for the moment the enemy would commit to a fixed position. They found it at Munda. Or rather, the Pompeians found it for them. The intelligence coming in was consistent. Gnaeus Pompey had chosen his ground and was not moving. 13 legions on the ridge, 6,000 cavalry under Labienus dispersed along the flanks, the city of Munda at their backs, close enough to retreat into, but not close enough to make the ridge itself defensible in a siege sense. It was a pure field fortification. Come and take it. Caesar assembled his commanders. The options were not complicated, but none of them were good. He could wait, deny the Pompeians battle, and attempt to starve them out, raid their supply lines, force a situation where they had to come down off the ridge and engage on ground of his choosing. This was the sensible option. This was also the option Caesar understood was not available to him, not because of tactical reasons, but because of political ones. Caesar needed this war finished. He had been fighting for 4 years. His veterans wanted to go home. The situation in Rome was increasingly unstable in ways that required his physical presence, and perhaps most urgently, an army of 70,000 men in Hispania costs money every single day it exists. The Pompeians could sustain that cost longer than Caesar could sustain the political pressure of an unresolved war. He needed to attack. He could flank, attempt to maneuver around the ridge entirely and force the Pompeians to abandon their position or be cut off. But the terrain did not allow it cleanly. The approaches to both flanks of the Pompeian position were constrained in ways that would have required splitting his force, and a split force attacking separate sections of a unified defensive line against a 2-to-1 numerical advantage was a path to catastrophe. That left the direct assault, up the slope, into the teeth of 13 legions supported by 6,000 cavalry, with 40,000 men against 70,000, attacking uphill, crossing a marshy stream to begin the approach. We need to stop and let that arithmetic sink in. This is not a scenario that exists in military history as a recipe for victory. The Pompeians, by the conventional logic of ancient warfare, should have destroyed the attacking force simply by maintaining their position and allowing the slope to do its work. Labienus, who understood Caesar's methods better than any man alive, must have looked at the situation and believed, with genuine confidence, that the attacker's disadvantage was insurmountable. He was almost right. Caesar's formation was not symmetrical. He had made deliberate choices about weight distribution that are worth examining carefully, because they reveal exactly how he intended to solve the problem of the uphill assault. On his right wing, Caesar placed the 10th Legion, his most storied formation, the veterans who had fought with him through every phase of the Gallic Wars and the Civil War, men who had known him personally for a decade. Behind them, supporting the right wing, he placed heavy cavalry. The right wing was the striking element. It was the part of the line Caesar intended to push hardest and earliest, aiming to buckle the Pompeian left before the exhaustion of the uphill assault could accumulate across the entire front. On his far left, Caesar positioned the Moorish cavalry under King Bogud. This placement was not accidental. Bogud's horsemen were not heavy cavalry in the Roman sense. They were lighter, faster, more mobile, and more suited to operational flexibility than to a frontal engagement.
Place them on the far left, not to attack with them immediately, but to have them available as a contingency force. The shape of what that contingency would become was not yet clear, not to Caesar, and certainly not to the Pompeians watching from the ridge. Caesar tried one more thing before ordering the assault. He attempted to lure the Pompeians down from the ridge. The specifics of how this was done are not fully recorded, but the method was likely a combination of provocative maneuver and feigned weakness, moving forces in ways that suggested vulnerability, inviting a Pompeian counterattack that would bring them off the high ground and onto the plain. It failed. Gnaeus Pompey and Labienus held position. They had chosen this ground deliberately, and they were not going to abandon it because Caesar waved his arms invitingly from below. What followed was the worst possible outcome for Caesar's force. He issued the order. His army began to move toward the slope. Imagine being in the front rank of the 10th Legion on that morning. You have been a soldier for somewhere between 8 and 15 years. You have fought in Gaul, possibly in Africa, certainly in multiple engagements against Pompeian forces during the Civil War. You have crossed the Rubicon. You have watched your general make decisions that should have destroyed his army, and somehow watched him pull victory from situations that still do not make sense to you even now. You are a professional. You know what an uphill assault looks like. You know what the stream at the bottom means: wet feet, disturbed footing, the brief moment of maximum vulnerability when you are crossing running water in formation, while the enemy above you can throw things. You cross anyway, because this is Caesar, because the 10th does not stop. The Pompeians opened with javelins. This was standard procedure, the pilum volley at the point of engagement, followed by close combat with gladii. But on the slope, the dynamic of this exchange was different from a flat engagement. The Pompeians above had not only the normal throw range, but the additional distance purchased by the elevation. Their rear ranks, the 3 or 4 ranks behind the front line, could throw over the heads of their own men and land javelins on the attacking front ranks before contact was made. This is not conjecture, it is the direct consequence of the terrain geometry, and it is why the sources note sustained missile fire from the Pompeian rear ranks as a specific feature of this engagement. The 10th Legion made contact with the Pompeian left. What followed is described in the sources as a brutal melee, and that description is, if anything, understated. A melee on a slope is unlike a melee on flat ground in almost every physical respect. The man above you has leverage you do not have. His weight comes forward and down. Your weight comes forward and up. The gladius, the short Roman stabbing sword designed for the close-quarters press of a formed infantry engagement, functions differently when you are trying to push it upward into a man who is braced above you than when you are driving it forward on level ground. And that difference compounds across every individual combat across the entire front of the 10th Legion simultaneously. 8 hours. That is how long this phase of the battle lasted. 8 hours of this kind of fighting. No decisive breakthrough, no collapse. The 10th pushed and the Pompeian left held. The Pompeian left pushed and the 10th held. Casualties accumulated on both sides in the way that only a sustained infantry melee accumulates casualties, not in dramatic charges and retreats, but in the steady arithmetic of individual men going down, being replaced, going down again. Caesar moved along the line. He did not stay in one place. He could see the shape of what was happening. The right wing was his strike element, and it was being absorbed rather than exploiting. The Pompeian left was not breaking. It was bending slightly under the pressure of the 10th's aggression, but bending is not breaking, and on a slope with a deep formation behind it, bending can be sustained indefinitely. The moment came, no one can say exactly when, in the middle hours of this long afternoon, when Caesar understood that the situation was approaching a crisis, not the manageable kind of crisis that he had navigated dozens of times by adjusting formations or committing reserves, the real kind, the kind where the mathematics of attrition are trending in the wrong direction and the window for changing them is narrowing. He walked into the line. He stood beside his veterans.
He made himself visible, and the line held. Here is where it gets interesting, because what happened next was not, as most accounts presented, a straightforward acceleration of Caesar's plan coming to fruition. What happened next was a sequence of events in which every individual decision made tactical sense, and the combination of them produced a catastrophe that nobody planned for. The 10th Legion, stabilized and perhaps galvanized by Caesar's presence in the line, pushed harder. Not a breakthrough, not a rout, a sustained, grinding increase in pressure against the Pompeian left that began to tell. The Pompeian left flank began to buckle, not collapse, but show signs of genuine stress, gaps in the formation, men leaning back instead of leaning into the fight. The subtle but unmistakable signs visible to experienced officers on both sides that a formation is approaching its limit. Gnaeus Pompey saw it. He had reserves, a fresh legion, and he made the decision that any competent commander in his position would make. He thinned his right wing and ordered a legion-strength force to march across the rear of his battle line to reinforce the failing left. This was textbook Roman military procedure. It was exactly what the training manuals, if Rome had had training manuals, would have prescribed. Move strength from where you have surplus to where you are failing. Do it quickly before the left collapses entirely. The infantry column began its march across the rear of the Pompeian battle line, a slow lateral movement, visible from a distance, raising its own dust, creating the visual impression of a large body of men moving away from the fight. King Bogud saw it from the far left of Caesar's line, and here is where the battle turned. Bogud's Moorish cavalry had been waiting on that far left wing for hours. They had watched the engagement develop. They had watched the slugging match on the slope. They had watched, and they had not found a clean moment to commit. Now, suddenly, there was chaos in the Pompeian rear, an infantry column marching laterally, dust rising, the natural confusion of a large formation redirecting itself in the middle of an ongoing battle. The Pompeian right, from which that reinforcing legion had been drawn, was now visibly thinner than it had been an hour before. Bogud saw an opening. He took it. The Moorish cavalry rode in a wide arc around the Pompeian right, not a direct charge into the flank, but a deep sweep around the thinned section of the line, bypassing the main engagement entirely and targeting the Pompeian baggage camp in the rear. This was a devastating move if it worked. Baggage camps contained everything an army needed to continue existing: food, equipment, the personal possessions of officers, the pay chests, the animals, the non-combatants who kept a Roman army functional. To lose your camp in the middle of a battle was not merely a material catastrophe, it was a psychological one. The smoke from a burning camp, visible from inside the battle line, told your soldiers something specific and terrible, that you had already lost, even if your weapons were still in your hands. Caesar saw the opportunity Bogud's move had created and acted immediately. He ordered his third-line reserve, the troops he had been holding back throughout this entire 8-hour engagement, forward into the main battle line. A fresh wave of men replacing the exhausted fighters who had been on the slope all afternoon, hitting the already weakened Pompeian front at the moment when a significant portion of the Pompeian right had just left to reinforce the left, and when the baggage camp was under attack from the cavalry sweeping around behind. 3 simultaneous pressures. The 10th Legion pushing harder on the left, the fresh third line hitting the center and right, Bogud's cavalry in the rear. The Pompeian army, for the first time all afternoon, was being attacked from multiple directions at once. Labienus saw what was happening, and here, finally, is where we arrive at the decision that killed 30,000 men. Labienus commanded the cavalry. His elite horsemen had been positioned on the Pompeian left, the same flank where the 10th Legion had been applying sustained pressure all afternoon. When Bogud's Moorish cavalry swept around the right and headed for the baggage camp, Labienus faced a decision that had no clean solution. If he left the camp to burn, if he did nothing about Bogud's flanking ride, the army would likely hold its ground physically, but collapse psychologically when the smoke went up. The soldiers in the line would see their camp burning and draw the obvious conclusion: he could not do nothing.
If he stripped his cavalry from the Pompeian left entirely and sent everything to intercept Bogud, he would remove the flank protection from the left wing at the exact moment the 10th Legion was pushing hardest. The left might survive it, but it might also collapse with its cavalry support gone. Labienus found what he believed was the middle path. He disengaged 5 cohorts of cavalry from the Pompeian left, not all of them, but a significant portion, and wheeled them around toward the camp, intending to intercept Bogud before he could do his worst. It was a tactically defensible decision. He was preserving a portion of his cavalry on the left while committing enough to intercept the threat to the rear. It was the decision a competent, experienced cavalry commander makes when he is trying to manage multiple simultaneous threats with insufficient resources. And it killed the Pompeian army. Not because the decision itself was wrong.
because of what it looked like. Think about what the Pompeian center could see in that moment. They had been fighting uphill for 8 hours. They were exhausted in the way that only sustained melee combat exhausts, not the tiredness of a long march, but the specific, bone-deep depletion of men who had been locked in individual mortal combat for most of a March afternoon. Their vision was limited. The dust of 70,000 men fighting on a dry ridge in March was extraordinary, the kind of thing that reduces visibility to a few meters in any direction and makes the sounds of battle into a directionless roar. Through that dust, they could see the infantry column that Pompey had ordered to reinforce the left, marching across the rear of the line, away from the fighting, toward the left flank. A large body of men moving away. Then, moments later, the cavalry cohorts under Labienus, wheeling, turning, galloping, in the direction of the camp, another large body of men moving away. 2 separate, simultaneous movements, both moving away from the front, both raising dust, both visible only partially through the chaos and obscurity of an 8-hour engagement to men who were already at the edge of their endurance and who had just seen Caesar's reserve line advancing toward them from across the plain. This is what the Pompeian center saw. Not a lateral reinforcement movement and a cavalry interception, the actual tactical reality. What they saw was the beginning of a rout. What they saw was the officers leaving first, as officers in a losing army always leave first. What they saw was the signs they had been trained, through years of military experience, to recognize as the prelude to total collapse. And they ran. The military vocabulary for what happened next is precise. It is called a panic rout, not a fighting withdrawal, not a tactical retreat, not even a disorderly pullback. A panic rout is when a formed military unit loses its cohesion so completely and so suddenly that it ceases to function as a military unit at all. Men throw away their shields, they stop listening to officers, they stop thinking about anything except the one direction that feels like survival, which is away, away from the slope, away from the enemy, toward the walls of Munda behind them. 13 legions broke simultaneously. The timing was catastrophic in a way that almost defies comprehension. A staggered collapse, one wing breaking while another held, would have given some men a chance, but the panic spread too fast. It moved through the formation the way fire moves through dry grass, not because every man made a rational calculation and reached the same conclusion, but because panic is contagious in a way that courage is not. One man sees the cavalry leaving and turns to the man next to him. That man sees 2 people turning, and the information transforms from uncertain signal to confirmed fact in an instant. The formation did not break, it disintegrated, and Caesar's men pursued them. Here we must speak plainly about what Roman pursuit of a broken army actually meant. The slaughter of retreating soldiers was not incidental to Roman military practice, it was the point. The pursuit was where battles became decisive, where a tactical victory became a strategic annihilation. Caesar's legions, veterans who had been grinding uphill for 8 hours and were now suddenly chasing a fleeing enemy downhill, showed no mercy. The sources do not record that they were ordered not to show mercy. The sources record 30,000 dead. 30,000. For reference, that is the size of a modern division. In a single afternoon, on a hillside in southern Spain. Caesar himself wrote, in one of the most chilling passages of the commentaries attributed to this period, that this was the most difficult and dangerous battle of his entire career, a battle he nearly lost, a battle he stood in the line for personally because the alternative was losing it. The numbers bear him out. His own casualties at Munda were enormous. Some estimates suggest 1,000 killed and 5,000 wounded, though the ancient sources vary and the exact figures are uncertain. What is not uncertain is that this was the bloodiest engagement Caesar's army had fought in the Civil War. Not Pharsalus, not Thopsis, Munda. And when it was over, the pursuit ran the fleeing Pompeians into the walls of the city of Munda itself, which was, in one of the war's darker ironies, the very thing that had made the Pompeian position feel so secure that morning. The city became a trap. 30,000 men died between the ridge and the walls. Titus Labienus died on the field. There is something deeply significant about that fact that most histories mention in passing without dwelling on. Labienus, the man who knew Caesar better than any enemy Caesar had ever faced, the man who had once been his closest operational partner, the man whose choice of sides at the beginning of the Civil War had arguably cost Caesar more sleep than any other defection, died on the same slope where his tactical decision had been misread as retreat. The long rivalry was over, not with a dramatic confrontation, not with the personal duel that legend might have demanded. Labienus died in the chaos of a collapsing battle line, on a hillside in Hispania, fighting to the end. Whatever he thought in his final moments, whether he understood what had happened, whether he recognized the terrible irony that his completely sound tactical decision had destroyed everything, is beyond recovery. Caesar, according to the sources, ordered a proper burial for Labienus. This tells us something. In a war where Caesar had been known to extend mercy and to honor fallen enemies, the gesture toward Labienus was not perfunctory. These were men who had known each other for more than a decade, who had built something together in Gaul, something real, something that changed history. The hatred that followed the Civil War's beginning was the hatred of intimacy betrayed. And whatever Caesar felt when he learned that Labienus was dead, he did not dishonor the body. Gnaeus Pompey escaped the field. He was not one of the 30,000. Whether this was luck or intention, whether he left before the collapse or managed to fight his way through the pursuing legions, is not clearly recorded. He survived the battle and ran, which is either the most human thing a man in an impossible situation could do, or the final indictment of his leadership, depending on how you choose to read the moment. He was captured days later. He was executed. His brother Sextus was not at Munda. Sextus Pompey would survive, would rebuild, would become a thorn in the side of the Second Triumvirate for years after Caesar's death. But the Pompeian cause, in any organized sense, died at Munda. The legions were gone. The commanders were gone. The political infrastructure that had sustained armed opposition to Caesar, the money, the networks, the provincial governors who had cast their lot with the Republican side, was gone. Julius Caesar rode out of Hispania as the only man in the Roman world who mattered. He returned to Rome in the autumn of 45 BC. The triumph he celebrated for Munda was muted compared to the 4-day spectacle of the African campaign. Partly this was practical. You did not celebrate killing other Romans the same way you celebrated conquering foreign kings. Partly it was something else, something in the mood of Rome that Caesar, for all his political genius, seems to have misread. He had been away for most of 4 years. In his absence, Rome had been governed by officers and allies, men who carried his authority but not his presence. The Republic's institutions, which had been degrading long before Caesar crossed the Rubicon, were now so hollowed out that they functioned more as forms than as realities. The Senate met, the courts operated, the magistrates were elected, but the elections were managed, the courts bent in predictable directions, and the Senate understood that its deliberations carried weight only insofar as the man who had just defeated 13 legions at Munda agreed that they should. Caesar came back from Hispania and began plans. A campaign against Parthia, the Eastern Empire that had destroyed Crassus and his legions at Carrhae in 53 BC, that represented both a genuine military threat and enormous political opportunity. He issued calendar reforms, infrastructure programs, colonial settlement plans. He moved through Rome with the energy of a man who had just survived the hardest battle of his life, and who believed, with perhaps some justification, that the hardest things were now behind him. On the Ides of March 44 BC, less than 13 months after the Battle of Munda, he was stabbed 23 times on the floor of a building adjacent to the theater of Pompey.
The assassins included men he had pardoned, men he had elevated, men who had served him. The list of conspirators reads, in places, like a guest list for a dinner party hosted by Caesar himself: Brutus, Cassius, Decimus Brutus, Trebonius, men who had watched him build his supremacy and had decided, too late, or exactly on time, depending on how you measure these things, that the cure was worse than the disease. And here, finally, is the question that Munda raises and that nobody quite asks. Caesar won the Battle of Munda because 30,000 men panicked, not because they were cowards. They were Roman legionaries, some of the most professionally conditioned soldiers in the ancient world. They panicked because the tactical situation produced a set of ambiguous visual signals that, in the dust and exhaustion and terror of an 8-hour uphill melee, were indistinguishable from the signs of total collapse. Labienus made the right decision, the soldiers read it wrong, and 30,000 men died. Now consider what Caesar did with his victory. He came home to a city that was watching him with the same intensity that the Pompeian center had watched Labienus's cavalry, looking for signals, trying to read the ambiguous movements of a powerful man and determine what they meant. Was the calendar reform a genuine improvement to Roman civic life, or was it a demonstration of autocratic authority? Were the colonial settlements practical policy, or were they a mechanism to distribute loyal veterans in strategic locations? Was the Parthian campaign military necessity, or was it the opening move toward Alexander-style monarchy? Caesar thought these questions were answerable. He thought he could make his intentions clear. He thought the Senate could read his movements accurately. He was wrong in the same way the Pompeian center was wrong at Munda. Not because the movements were deceptive, but because the men watching had been conditioned by everything they had experienced: years of civil war, years of watching republican institutions collapse, years of watching powerful men accumulate unprecedented authority, to interpret ambiguous signals as confirmation of their worst fears. The difference was that at Munda, the misreading produced panic and flight. In Rome, on the Ides of March, it produced 23 stab wounds and the man who had won the Roman world dying on the floor of a Roman building, while the men who killed him congratulated themselves on saving a republic that had, in practical terms, already ceased to exist. Munda was Caesar's greatest victory. It was also, in a very specific way, the template for his death. He had won a battle because his enemies misread a tactical movement. He lost his life because his allies misread a political one. The misreading is the thread that runs through both stories, the human tendency, under pressure, to take ambiguous information and transform it through fear and exhaustion and prior conditioning into certainty. Labienus knew that. He had spent his career studying how armies break. He understood that the most dangerous moment in a battle was not when men were being killed, but when they stopped trusting their own perception of what was happening. He died trying to prevent exactly that moment from arriving. It arrived anyway, because that is what panic does. It finds the gap between what is actually happening and what the exhausted, frightened, dust-blinded mind can comprehend, and in that gap, it writes its own story. 30,000 men died at Munda because of what one cavalry formation looked like from the wrong angle, at the wrong moment, through the wrong filter. Julius Caesar died in Rome 13 months later because of what one man's ambition looked like to the men who had fought beside him, survived beside him, and ultimately decided they could no longer to trust what they were seeing. History does not always end cleanly. Sometimes the man who wins the last battle is also the man who has, in winning it, already lost the thing he was fighting for. The Ides of March came for Caesar less than a year after Munda. The republic he had destroyed did not survive him by much longer. What followed, the chaos of the Second Triumvirate, the wars of succession, the eventual emergence of Augustus, was a 30-year blood-soaked reckoning with the question Caesar had answered at Munda, but never quite answered in Rome. Who, in the end, gets to decide what the movements of a powerful man actually mean? Nobody, it turns out, not even Caesar.